The settlement of Novokhatske, tucked into the Volnovakha district of Donetsk region, is now flying under the authority of the armed forces of Ukraine again, after having spent time in Russian hands since last year. The operation wasn't the work of a single unit. Soldiers from the 37th Separate Marine Brigade moved in alongside paratroopers from the 79th Separate Tavria Air Assault Brigade, coordinating a joint push to clear the village house by house. This wasn't a quick sweep. The ground here is heavily mined, and the enemy had no intention of leaving without a fight, and every meter forward came with resistance. But step by step, the Marines and the air assault troops kept pressing. They cleared position after position, absorbed the counterattacks thrown at them, and refused to slow down. By the time it was over, the Russian force holding Novokhatske had been pushed out entirely and some killed. Others forced into a retreat that left the settlement firmly back in Ukrainian hands. It's a small dot on the map, but every one of these villages represents ground that had to be fought for twice, first to be lost and now to be taken back.
Inside lines! Come on! Inside lines! Inside lines!
There's Russians! Shoot! Shoot! Go! In!
I can't see shit!
Not every fight in this war happens at a distance. Sometimes it comes down to two men, a few meters apart in the middle of a field. That's what happened in the Zaporizhzhia direction, where a scout from the 132nd Separate Reconnaissance Battalion found himself face-to-face with a Russian soldier. There was no time to call anything in. The Ukrainian fighter threw a grenade, then opened up with his rifle, forcing the occupier backward. The Russian soldier broke and ran, ducking into a patch of thick brush, trying to use the terrain to disappear, but it didn't work. A strike FPV drone had already been tracking the engagement, and it followed him straight into the thicket until there was no place left to hide. The occupier didn't survive the chase. The Ukrainian scout, who stood his ground and fought at close range, walked away from the encounter without a scratch. In the Kharkiv region, Ukrainian aerial reconnaissance had been quietly watching a supply route for days, a route the Russians were using to move food, ammunition, and gear up toward their positions at the front. Once the pattern was confirmed, pilots from the 58th Separate Motorized Infantry Brigade seeded the road with remote mines the night before, and then waited. A Russian quad bike loaded with supplies rolled straight into it and was blown apart by the charge. What followed looked almost frantic on camera. The Russian troops scrambling out to save whatever cargo they could, dragging the damaged bike by hand toward a tree line and trying to get it out of sight before anyone noticed. But they weren't fast enough. The Ukrainian pilots were already moving in with a string of FPV drones, and within moments the vehicle was engulfed, the flames climbing high enough to be seen from a distance. Sometimes the enemy does the work for you. This next clip, filmed by the 210th Separate Assault Regiment in the Sumy region, shows exactly that. A Ukrainian drone had closed in on two Russian assault troops moving together. One of them panicked and raised his rifle, trying to shoot the drone out of the sky. But in the chaos of the moment, he wasn't paying attention to where his comrade was standing. The rounds meant for the UAV tore into the other soldier instead. The Russian, who opened fire, never hit the drone. What he did hit was one of his own men. Ukrainian operators from the 210th caught the whole thing on camera, a reminder that under pressure, even trained soldiers can turn a threat into a tragedy of their own making. This next piece of footage is difficult to watch, but it's part of the record of this war. It comes from the Archon Strike drone unit operating under the 108th Battalion, and it shows the final minutes of a Russian soldier caught alone in open terrain. Isolated with no way out and a drone circling overhead, the man made the decision to take his own life. The footage shows him attempting it 3 times with his small arms before it was over, first firing into the air and then turning the weapon on himself. It's a grim scene and one that speaks to the psychological weight this war puts on the men sent to fight it, often with little support and even less hope of retreat. Away from the battlefield, the diplomatic picture hasn't shifted either. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov made it clear, once again, that Moscow has no intention of agreeing to a ceasefire. Speaking at a joint press conference alongside Mozambique's Foreign Minister Maria Lukash, Lavrov repeated the same conditions Vladimir Putin laid out more than a year earlier, back in June of 2024. Putin's demands haven't moved an inch since then, a complete Ukrainian withdrawal from the Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson regions. Territory Russian forces have never actually managed to fully occupy, plus international recognition of those regions and Crimea as Russian. On top of that, the Kremlin is still insisting Ukraine abandon any path toward NATO membership, and it continues to lean on the same tired language of demilitarization and denazification that's defined Russian messaging since the start of the invasion. Putin has claimed that if all of these conditions are met, Russia would immediately agree to stop fighting. Lavrov underlined that nothing about that position has changed. In his words, the Russian president had simply confirmed the same goals he set out back in June 2024. In other words, no compromise, no shift, and no ceasefire. Just the same list of demands repeated once again for the cameras.
Нами пресечены теракты и в других регионах России, в том числе в местах массового пребывания людей, в отношении объектов транспорта, энергетики.
Back on the battlefield. Fighter pilots carried out a wave of precision strikes across several sections of the front using aerial bombs to hit some of the most valuable targets available. The enemy assault groups massing for an attack, control points used to operate Russian drones, and workshops storing ammunition. These weren't random targets. Every location struck was a building the Russians were using to house troops or run their combat operations from. When the bombs landed, they took out both the structures and the personnel inside them, and disrupting the enemy's ability to organize before their assaults even got started. Down in the south, drone crews from the State Border Guard Service have been running their own campaign of precision strikes against Russian positions. During a routine reconnaissance flight, Border Guard pilots spotted something worth hitting, namely a D-30 Howitzer, sitting alongside enemy technical equipment and manned positions. They didn't waste the opportunity. A series of targeted strikes followed, and by the end of it, the artillery piece, the equipment around it, and the soldiers manning the position had all been destroyed. Few weapons in this war have earned the reputation that HIMARS and this next clip shows exactly. 2 launchers from the 19th Missile Brigade, known as St. Barbara, were filmed operating side by side close enough to work almost in rhythm with one another. One after the other, they fired rockets downrange at Russian positions, cycling through their launches with the kind of precision that's become the brigade's trademark. Day or night, the pair keeps working fast, accurate, and devastating for whatever's on the receiving end. The final clip in this roundup comes from Ukraine's B-2 unit, operating in the rear areas of Russian-occupied Luhansk Oblast. Their target was a military lorry packed with personnel from the occupying force and moving through territory the Russians probably assumed was safe from Ukrainian reach. But they were wrong. A Kamikaze drone closed in on the vehicle, tracking it at close range before making its final approach. The footage captures the strike as it happens, a reminder that even far behind the front line, Russian forces aren't out of range of Ukraine's drone units. That's the picture from the front this week. Ground retaken in Donetsk, close quarters fighting in Zaporizhzhia, drone strikes hitting supply routes, artillery and troop transports across multiple sectors, and on the diplomatic side, a Kremlin still refusing to budge from the same demands it set out over a year ago. The war grinds on every front at once, the battlefield and the negotiating table alike. Thanks for watching all the way through. Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next one.
And if you want to support the channel, make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal. The links are in the description below.